Under a shroud of darkness, the small town of Millersville lay quiet, seemingly untouched by the chaos that simmered just beneath the surface. The only sounds breaking the eerie stillness were the soft rustle of wind against the tall corn stalks and the distant hooting of an owl, its mournful cry echoing through the night. But this tranquility was a guise of fragile veil hiding a battle that had begun to brew on the outskirts of town. In a weathered farmhouse that stood defiantly against the backdrop of a starlit sky, Jacob Turner, a proud farmer nearing his 60s, was preparing for bed. His hands, calloused and worn from decades of toil, moved methodically through his evening routine. He paused for a moment, gazing out the window at the expanse of his land stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Jacob had inherited this land from his father, who'd inherited it from his before him. It was more than just soil, it was legacy, memory, a lifeline. But tonight, unease settled deep in his bones. A week ago, he'd run into a couple of strangers at the local feed store. Their whispers, too conspiratorial for comfort, had stirred an instinctive fear within him. "We're looking for land," one had said, his voice low and menacing. Jacob had dismissed them, assuming they were just opportunistic investors, but the look in their eyes told him there was something more sinister lurking in their intentions. As he switched off the lights and climbed into bed, sleep eluded him. His drive called to him, the 20 acres of corn and soybeans swaying gently in rhythm with the winds of fate. Just as he was drifting into a restless slumber, a loud crash shattered the stillness. Heart racing, Jacob bolted upright. Was it a dream? No, it was real, a cacophony of breaking wood and smashing glass echoed from the barn. Jacob grabbed a flashlight, his breath shallow, each heartbeat thundering in his ears as he slipped into his boots. The cool night air pressed against his skin as he stepped outside, illuminating the path ahead with the beam of light. The barn sat ominously in the shadows, an ancient sentinel guarding secrets etched in the wood. He called, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing in his stomach. Silence draped over the barn. He crept forward, the flashlight beams shaking slightly with his apprehension. Then, just beyond the half-open barn door, he saw them, shadows, 3 men, clad in black, rummaging through his tools, their movements calculated, predatory. "Hey," Jacob shouted, adrenaline fueling his voice. The men froze, recognizing they had been caught, and then turned to face him. Fierce eyes glinted in the darkness, revealing their intentions. It was clear they were not mere thieves, they were hunters. One of the men, taller with a menacing grin, stepped forward. "You should have sold the land when we asked," he sneered. Jacob stood tall despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I'm not selling, not to you, not to anyone." The man laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "You really think you can keep this place?" For a moment their eyes locked, and in that brief span, Jacob felt the weight of his lineage pressing down on him. His grandparents had cherished this land, his father had poured his heart into it. He recalled summers spent playing in the fields, evenings spent gathering around the dinner table filled with stories of resilience and grit. This land wasn't just dirt, it was the embodiment of his family's dreams, struggles, and spirit. "I won't yield," Jacob said, his voice steady. "You can threaten me all you want." The men exchanged glances of disbelief, their confidence faltering momentarily. "Stubborn fool," the tall one spat. With that, they pulled back like shadows disappearing into the night, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread. Jacob stood there, breathless. Doubts crept in. Had he just made a mistake? Days passed, each one darker than the last. Jacob secured his farmhouse, installing better locks on the doors and setting up lights around the perimeter. But with each passing day, he felt their presence creeping closer. It wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about survival. He worked through the exhaustion that draped over him like a cloak, tending to his crops, yet his mind raced with plans of protection. He told his neighbors, voiced his concerns to the sheriff, but the response was always the same. "Could be nothing, Jacob." They didn't understand the gravity of his situation. Then one stormy night, while the rain lashed down in vengeful sheets, there came a knock at the door. It reverberated through the house, carrying a weight that sent chills down his spine. Holding his breath, Jacob approached the door. Peeking through the peephole, he saw the silhouette of the tall man from the barn, flanked by 2 others, their eyes glinting with malice. This was not just a visit, it was intimidation at its peak. As he unlatched the door, he felt the tremor of fear within him. He demanded, though he knew their answer before it escaped their lips. "We're here to talk," the man said, stepping inside uninvited, his dark presence swallowing the light around him. "It's time you reconsider what this all means to you. I'm not interested in your threats." The man's chuckle filled the room, a sound that made Jacob's skin crawl. "This doesn't end here, old man." With that, they stormed out, leaving Jacob in the throes of fear and anger. He slammed the door, rage bubbling beneath the surface. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. Shadows flickered, distorting every familiar corner of his home. That night, sleep eluded him once again, yet determination burned bright in his heart. He began to draw plans, real plans. He contacted local farmers, gathering a network of support, eyes that shared the same glint of stubborn resolve. Each farmer had faced their own battles against the encroachment of corporate land interests, against the lure of easy profits that required selling their souls. Little did he know that those men were not just hunting land, they represented a dark force, a crime syndicate that preyed on vulnerable farmers across the county. Over the years, their tactics had grown bolder and their schemes had grown more violent. The next day, armed with information and a newfound sense of purpose, Jacob visited the sheriff again. "You need to listen. I can't be the only one they're targeting." The sheriff, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, hesitated before responding. "We've heard rumblings about them. They've overridden a couple of farmers in the past months." Frustration bubbled within him like a boiling pot threatening to overflow. The sheriff sighed, his face turning grim. "Just keep your eyes open." Jacob felt like he was standing at a brink, caught between law and lawlessness. Each day blurred into the next as he fortified his defenses and built alliances with neighboring farmers. The community began to rally behind him, aware now of the invisible war being waged on the very ground they walked. The soil beneath their feet was not just a resource, but a heritage worth fighting for. Weeks passed and the tension escalated. Then, on a crisp autumn night, Jacob lay in bed, the sound of rustling leaves outside sounding like whispered warnings. Then came the sound he dreaded, a vehicle's engine growling low, creeping toward his land. In a flash, Jacob was out of bed. Heart racing, he peered through the window just as headlights illuminated the yard. He caught sight of the three men in black, armed and determined, approaching his house. Panic surged through him, but he quickly regained control. This wasn't just about him anymore. He grabbed his phone and, trembling, dialed the sheriff. "They're here right now. Stay put, we're on our way," the sheriff answered, urgency slicing through the calm. But Jacob couldn't just stand idly by. He grabbed an old baseball bat from the corner of the room and headed for the door, each step heavy with impending danger. The men had surrounded his home, their laughter slicing through the tension like a knife. The tall one shouted tauntingly. His voice boomed in the night, but Jacob felt an overwhelming determination pulse through him. "Not a chance," he shouted back, surprising even himself. Then, as quick as a flash, Jacob swung open the door, bat raised high. The men recoiled slightly, momentarily stunned by the sudden confrontation. But then the tall man laughed, stepping forward unfazed. Jacob's grip tightened on the bat. This was a defining moment, the embodiment of everything he stood for. Then came the sounds of sirens, piercing through the silent night, growing louder with every passing second. The men glanced at each other, a flicker of uncertainty crossing their faces. "Time to go," the tall man growled, retreating slightly. Jacob didn't back down. "It ends here." With the sirens blaring close now, the men scrambled back into their vehicle, speeding away, leaving behind the echo of their taunts in the dark. Jacob stood there, heart racing, bat trembling in his hands, knowing it wasn't the end. But it was a victory, a message sent loud and clear. As the sheriff's car pulled into the driveway, Jacob could hardly contain his relief and anxiety. He lowered the bat, cautiously walking toward the sheriff, sharing the whirlwind of emotions clawing at his insides. The battle had just begun, but he wasn't fighting alone anymore. The farmers rallied behind him, a network ironclad against the encroaching darkness. They pooled resources and organized a real fight, one based on truth, unity, and unwavering spirit. With each passing moment, Jacob felt stronger, more supported. He began to learn the power of community, the importance of standing tall against injustice. And as they ventured forth, he understood this land wasn't just a plot of earth. It was a symbol of hope, resilience, and an unbreakable bond written in the sweat of generations past. With every swing of the bat, every rallying cry, and every moment of courage, Jacob stood not just for himself, but for every farmer whose legacy was entwined in the roots of his land. They would not yield. Together, they would carve their own destiny in the face of those who sought to take away what was rightfully theirs. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange. It was a picturesque scene that had played out countless times before, a moment of tranquility on the Turner farm. But tonight, something sinister loomed in the air. Jacob Turner, a farmer with deep-rooted ties to his land, felt an unease settle deep into his bones, as if the ground itself was whispering warnings he dared not ignore. Earlier that day, as he walked along the rows of corn, he heard hushed whispers at the local diner. A group of rough-looking men had congregated at the bar, their laughter too loud, their glances too sharp. He'd overheard them discussing a plot, one that sent cold chills racing through him: land acquisition. They wanted what was his, the land that had been in his family for generations. Just beyond his fields lay a sprawling development plan, a developer eager to transform the countryside into something more profitable than a farm. Jacob was determined to hold on to the land that had fed his family for years. The weight of history pressed on him, fueled by nostalgia. His father had worked this soil, his grandfather before him, each planting season marked by sweat, toil, and an intrinsic connection to the earth. That night, as a storm rolled in, lightning split the sky, illuminating the darkened corners of his world. Jacob lay awake, restless, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. Had he seen those men before? Maybe, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were not leaving without a fight. Suddenly, a loud crash reverberated through the quiet night. Jacob bolted upright, heart pounding. A sickening feeling coiled in his stomach as he grabbed his flashlight and peered through the window. There in the shadows of the barn, he saw them, three men, clad in dark clothing, rummaging through his equipment like vultures picking at bones. He shouted, stepping outside, the intensity of his voice cutting through the heavy rain. They turned, and in that instant their faces morphed from surprise to amusement. The tallest among them stepped forward, arrogance dripping from his words. "What you think is yours will always belong to me," Jacob roared back, fear igniting an unexpected courage within him. The men laughed, and for a moment the sound chilled him more than the rain. "You should know better than to defy us," the tall one sneered. "This isn't just a negotiation, it's a takeover." But Jacob stood firm, fueled by anger and protectiveness. "Not on my land, you're not," he declared, every word heavy with conviction. The group hesitated, clearly taken aback by the old farmer's unexpected bravery. They exchanged glances, and Jacob seized that moment, charging forward, wielding his flashlight like a sword. With surprising agility, the men retreated into the shadows, their laughter fading into the night like a ghost. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had stood up to them, but the worry wrapped around him like a vice had merely delayed the inevitable. Days turned into weeks, and Jacob fortified his defenses. He patched up old fences, checked locks on doors, and invested in security lights, working late into the night. The land he loved was under siege, and each crack of thunder felt like a warning, a reminder of the danger looming over him. As he struggled, he discovered the power of community. Jacob reached out to his neighbors, sharing stories of the men who had invaded his land. They listened intently, faces grim. He wasn't the only one targeted. A wave of fear swept through Millersville as more landowners began voicing their concerns. Farmers who had spent years building their lives were suddenly at risk of losing everything. One evening, gathered at the local diner, tension hovered in the air like the smell of fresh coffee. A few of Jacob's fellow farmers opted to join him, each sharing their own tales of intimidation. Jim, a man with 3 struggling daughters, spoke up. "I'm terrified. What if they come for my land next?" The group exchanged worried glances, and Jacob felt the swell of determination begin to spread. "If we stand together, we can defend what is ours," he said, his voice strong, electrifying the room with a sense of unity. The farmers nodded, and it felt like a spark igniting a fire. With each conversation, adrenaline built within Jacob. Rather than feeling hopeless, he sensed their shared anger morph into courage. They began to form a coalition, creating plans to protect their land and, when necessary, fight together. As weeks slipped by, they met regularly, strategizing and pooling resources. Wisdom echoed through the rooms as they shared ideas, how to document interactions, gather evidence, and remain vigilant. But no one could have predicted the storm brewing beyond Millersville. Rumors began to circulate, hot and heavy, about the men targeting families who refused to sell. They were part of a criminal group known for using fear and sabotage to achieve their goals, creating an environment where no farmer felt safe. With every conversation, Jacob gathered bits of information. He learned of arsons, of threats, and even harassment that had pushed others to the brink of despair. Jacob knew that one day these shadows would loom larger, and he had to be ready. Then one fateful night, the tension escalated. Rain hammered down fiercely, drenching the earth as thunder boomed overhead. Jacob sat up late, his eyes scanning the fields from the window. Just then, the growl of an engine rumbled through the storm. He moved closer to the window and spotted headlights cutting through the rain, shadows shifting ominously beside a truck. His heart raced. He grabbed his phone and texted the group. "They're back." Before he could gather himself, the door crashed open. The men stormed in, the tall one leading the charge. "Don't think you can hide behind your friends." Adrenaline surged through Jacob as he stood his ground, feeling the presence of his neighbors and their promise of support linger in his mind. "Get out," the men laughed, a cruel mocking sound resonating in the cramped space. "This isn't the place to make threats, old man. You and your pals have made this a lot harder than it needs to be." Jacob's pulse quickened, and for a moment the weight of fear pressed down. But then he thought of the generations before him who had fought and sacrificed. "You may think you're powerful, but you don't know the strength that comes from standing for what's right," he said, his voice steady. In that moment, the door flew open, and a group of his farmers poured in, ready to defend their own. The once solid walls of fear began to crumble, replaced by unyielding resolve. Jim shouted, brandishing a flashlight like it was a torch lit with fire. The criminals hesitated, their bravado faltering. Realization washed over them. This wasn't just a simple land grab, it was a battle for survival, for community, for dignity. With newfound courage, Jacob took a step forward and declared, "You're outnumbered. This is our land, this is our future." The tension in the room shifted. The men, realizing the unity that had sprung forth, exchanged nervous glances. They were surrounded by an unexpected alliance, a force living in the agricultural heart of Millersville. The tall man gritted his teeth. He spat before retreating back into the night, uncertainty trailing behind them. As silence enveloped the room, an overwhelming sense of relief washed over Jacob and his fellow farmers. They had stood together arm in arm against a force that was meant to intimidate and conquer. But they knew the fight wasn't over. The shadows still lurked, and the criminals would return of that, Jacob was certain. And yet, for the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful. He turned to his neighbors. We need to report this. The following days were a blur of activity. Jacob worked tirelessly, gathering evidence of the encounter, documenting every detail. Together with the coalition, they prepared a case that would shine a light on the insidious actions threatening their existence. The town rallied behind them, and soon the sheriff's office began to take notice. A meeting was arranged, with local farmers bringing substantial evidence of threats and harassment. It was a defining moment, not just for Jacob, but for the preservation of their way of life. Throughout the meeting, Jacob stood strong, nerves buzzed with adrenaline, rallying fellow farmers to share their stories. His voice, steadied by attention, wove the threads of their experiences into a tapestry of resilience. The sheriff listened intently, his expression shifting from skepticism to indignation. "We won't let this stand." They left the meeting with a newfound sense of purpose, a powerful connection binding them together as they prepared for the storm that lay ahead. Jacob's heart swelled with pride, but still shadows lingered. Days turned into weeks and tension began to build once more. The criminals were not ready to back down. One evening, as Jacob worked late in the fields, he caught sight of a figure lurking near the edge of his property, barely visible in the fading light. A chill ran down his spine as he remembered the tension from before. He rushed back toward the house and reached for the phone, his hands trembling. He texted, gripping it tightly as he raced to the barn where he secured valuable tools. The group text lit up in response. He didn't have to wait long. Moments later, headlights illuminated the driveway, and soon the familiar faces of his neighbors arrived, each of them ready to stand firm alongside Jacob in the face of uncertainty. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice steadying others. With hearts racing, they formed a line, ready for whatever came next. Jacob took a deep breath, recalling the legacy of his family, grounded in the nurturing spirit of the land. They would not yield, come what may. Then, just as the tension peaked, two dark trucks pulled up, engines rumbling ominously. The men emerged, their faces twisted with wrath and arrogance, but this time they were met not by isolation, but with strength in numbers. The tall man stepped forward, sneering, "You think your little team can stop us?" Yet, as Jacob steadied himself, he felt something shift within him. This wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about community, about fighting against darkness, about preserving a way of life. Jacob roared, startling the men. In a flash, the air crackled with tension as the two sides faced off, but it was the farmers who stood resolute. Together they advanced, reclaiming their strength, refusing to back down. The criminals faltered, uncertainty creeping in as they saw the unwavering spirits aligned against them. In that moment, with raw courage igniting their resolve, they took a step back. "This isn't over," the tall man muttered, retreating to the safety of their trucks. Jacob and his neighbors stood tall, their hearts pounding, knowing they had won this battle, sending a powerful message that echoed across the fields. Days turned into weeks as Jacob and his community pressed onward, shining light on the shadows that sought to envelop them. The criminals were apprehended soon after, thanks to the relentless pursuit of justice by the sheriff and the unwavering support of the townsfolk. As the dust settled, Jacob stood in the fields beneath a radiant sunset, wind tousling his hair, listening to the whispers of the corn rustling in the breeze. He felt accomplished, proud of what they had achieved together, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. This was not just about land, it was about resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bonds forged through hardship. As he gathered with his fellow farmers, he knew they had embraced something far greater. They had embraced hope, defiance, and a future where community reigned over intimidation. They would hold on to this land, not just as a plot of earth, but as an intricate tapestry woven with love, sacrifice, and shared dreams. Jacob smiled, heart full, knowing that together they would continue to stand tall against any storm, refusing to yield to darkness. The night air was thick with tension, the kind that wraps around your chest and squeezes, leaving you breathless. Jacob Turner stood alone on his porch, the distant rumble of thunder underscoring the unease in the pit of his stomach. He glanced at the wide expanse of land stretching out before him, a patchwork of green and gold under the dim glow of a flickering porch light. This was his legacy, his father's legacy, a farm that had survived generations. But tonight, it felt like something dark loomed over it. Earlier that day, Jacob had heard whispers at the local diner. A group of rough-looking men had pushed through the door, laughter spilling out like shadows, drawing attention. They had no business in Millersville, yet their presence sent a chill down his spine. He caught snippets of frantic conversation, terms like land acquisition and easy money blending with the clanging of silverware. Jacob had seen them before. These were not ordinary investors. Trouble was brewing and the storm had only just begun. Now, with the clouds gathering overhead, he felt a deep instinct gnawing at him. Every farmer knows that when the environment shifts, so do the threats that lurk in the shadows. Just then, a break in the storm mirrored the fracture and his piece a loud crash echoed from the barn. Jacob's heart raced, adrenaline spiking. He bolted off the porch, grabbing his flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. It could have been just the wind, but he knew better. His gut told him it was the men from the diner. They had come for what they wanted, and he was not about to let them take it. He reached the barn, he flipped on the flashlight, illuminating shapes darting among the hay bales. 3 figures, their faces hidden beneath caps, scuttled around like rats. Jacob yelled, his voice firm, punctuating the silence with fearless resolve. The men froze. One stepped forward, smirking, eyes glinting with an unsettling mix of confidence and malice. "We're here to see how hard it will be to take this land from you," he said, arrogance dripping from every word. Jacob felt a surge of indignation. He barked back, a surprising strength emerging within him. The man laughed, a sound that sent chills coursing down Jacob's spine. "We knew you were tough, old man, but this isn't just a challenge, it's an offer." "Like hell I will," Jacob snapped, anger bubbling within him. The standoff felt electric, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. His land represented everything his family stood for: sacrifice, hard work, legacy. He wasn't about to roll over and give it up. The men exchanged gazes, and for a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered in their eyes. But the tall one shook it off, stepping closer, pushing his advantage. "You really think you can defend this place?" Jacob stood his ground, heart pounding. He wasn't just protecting dirt and crops, he was safeguarding a way of life. With a sudden movement, the men retreated, scrambling back into the darkness from which they came, their laughter trailing off into the night. Jacob remained frozen for several moments, adrenaline coursing through him. He hadn't won the battle, but he had stood firm. In the days that followed, he couldn't shake the feeling that they would return. Fear hung in the air like pregnant storm clouds. Jacob fortified his farmhouse, installing better locks and setting up lights around his property. He needed to be prepared. These men were not just out for money, they were criminals playing a dangerous game. Rumors spread through the small town of Millersville like wildfire. Jacob learned from neighbors more stories of intimidation. The man's voice trembled as he recounted the night he found his barn torched, a stark warning not to resist. The fear settled in deeper for Jacob, but alongside it came an unexpected fire, a determination to fight back, not only for himself but for everyone in their community. One evening, gathered at a local diner, Jacob laid out his plan to some of the other farmers sitting around the counter, their faces lined with concern and hope. "If we work together, we can stand our ground," he said, his voice steady yet passionate. "We can document everything they do, create a united front." Jim, a middle-aged farmer with a thick mustache, nodded. "I've been silenced long enough." Jacob felt a rush of pride. The spirit of community began to weave them together, each man realizing that they were not alone in this fight. The shadows might be closing in, but together they could shine a light bright enough to expose the darkness. As the weeks slipped by, they met regularly, sharing stories, documenting encounters, gathering evidence. The camaraderie transformed the fear into resilience. They forged plans, even discussed forming boundary patrols, being vigilant whenever dark figures appeared near their properties. With the growing support, courage flooded Jacob's heart. Then came a stormy night, much like the one when the men first arrived. Jacob had been working late, organizing notes and strategies, when suddenly there came a loud bang on his door. His heart raced. This was it. The criminals were back. Jacob opened the door to find the tall man staring back at him, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Thought you could hide from us." He motioned to his 2 companions lurking in the shadows behind him. Fear threatened to wash over Jacob, but he steadied himself. "You don't belong here." "Maybe so," the man retorted, "but we can make it costly for you if you continue to refuse our offer." This time Jacob was not alone. His neighbors, armed with flashlights and old farm tools, appeared behind him, a wall of defiance ready to stand. Jim stepped forward. "You don't scare us." The air thickened with tension. The men faltered, realizing they were confronting a united front. Jacob lifted his chin, fueled by the strength around him. At that moment, he saw doubt creep into the criminals' eyes. They were not anticipating this. They had thought they could intimidate one farmer, but here, standing together, were many. With an unexpected jerk, the tall man signaled the others, and they turned to leave. He shouted, his voice trailing off into the night. Jacob and his neighbors felt a rush of adrenaline. They had pushed back against fear. They called after them, defiant, a chorus of voices holding strong. The weeks that followed were filled with nervous anticipation. They stayed vigilant, united like a family, as rumors of the criminals' other activities deepened. Together, they alerted the sheriff, who began to patrol the area more diligently. Then, just when the weight of fear began to lift, came a day thick with tension. Jacob felt it shift in the air, heavy, like a storm approaching. That evening, he spotted headlights creeping toward his property. His heart plummeted as he recognized the men from the diner circling his land. He sent a message to the farmers, and they rallied together, ready to confront the looming darkness once more. As they gathered in defense, sweat trickled down their backs, but determination shone through the anxiety. With torches in hand, the farmers lined up near the edge of Jacob's property, an unyielding barrier against the encroaching night. When the criminals emerged from their truck, their expressions darkened, but they pressed forward with the bravado of wolves. The tall man called out, his voice laced with anger. Jacob shouted back, stepping forward, heart pounding with conviction. "We're not afraid of you, and we won't back down." The tension was palpable. The criminals hesitated, an unmistakable glimmer of uncertainty creeping onto their faces. The farmers behind Jacob stood firm, their unity acting as a powerful shield. Just then, the sound of a squad car lit up the scene, sirens wailing, and with that momentary distraction, the criminals retreated to their truck, frustration evident on their faces. The tall man spat as they sped away, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. As Jacob's heart raced, he felt something shift within him. They had not just defended the land tonight, they had defended each other. They had forged bonds in the fire of adversity, each encounter amplifying their resolve. The sheriff arrived moments later, eyebrows raised as he swept a gaze across the scene. "Looks like you've got your own battalion now," he said, impressed by the level of courage displayed by the farmers. "It's all of us together," Jacob said, the pride swelling within him. With the support growing stronger, Jacob felt invincible. But the battle was far from won. They spent days working to gather undeniable evidence, documenting every interaction they had with the criminals. Each member of the coalition played a vital part, filling gaps and ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Then came the day the tides truly turned. Jacob learned of a crucial development meeting that the criminal group was holding to outline their next steps. The farmers banded together, preparing to confront the source of their troubles directly. Standing outside the crowded meeting hall, they formed a line, a wall of solidarity. Whispers of apprehension and courage intermingled in the air as they prepared to face the men they had battled so fiercely. When the doors swung open, Jacob stepped inside first, flanked by Jim on one side and a group of their friends behind them. The tension in the room crackled like electricity, every eye drawn to their standing presence. Jacob shouted, his voice ringing clear, "We know what you've been doing." The room went silent, the weight of their words washing over everyone present. For a moment, Jacob caught sight of fear mirrored in the eyes of his opponents. It was a powerful realization this battle was not just about land. It was about standing firm against corruption, greed, and injustice. The tall man stood up, brushing off the shock, trying to regain composure. But Jacob saw the struggle behind his bravado. "This isn't just a negotiation anymore," Jacob pressed, steadying his voice. "You don't get to dictate our lives." With that declaration, he felt the room shift. Support surged from the other farmers behind him, voices rising, filled with resolve. They began to share their own experiences, recounting the intimidation tactics used against them. The tide was turning. The truth echoed, louder than any threat could overpower. The criminals shifted in their seats, knowing they were losing control, not just of the meeting, but of their power. In the end, the local authorities intervened. Through the evidence gathered and the testimonies given, the predators were pushed back, stopped from further tormenting the community they had once thought they could crush. When the dust settled, Jacob stood once again on his porch, the weight of fear lifted, replaced by the promise of hope. The land lay before him, vibrant and alive, the heart of a community beating strong. And as he looked out over the fields glowing in the late afternoon sun, he realized that the battle had forged connections deeper than any soil could hold. Jacob knew they would continue to stand firm together, defending their legacy against any storms that dared to come their way. They had not just refused to yield, they had reclaimed their strength, united in the belief that land, family, and justice would always prevail. In that moment, under the wide-open sky, he smiled, a confident, unyielding spirit rising within him like the sun setting over his cherished land. It was a quiet evening in Millersville when Jacob Turner first sensed trouble. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields of corn he had nurtured since he was a boy. But that evening, something felt different. The air was thick with an unshakable tension, a sense of foreboding that sent a shiver down his spine. He felt it in his bones, the kind of unease that tells you something is about to change. Earlier that afternoon, Jacob had taken a trip to the local diner, the heart of his small community. As he entered, the familiar tinkle of the bell above the door greeted him, and he settled into his usual corner booth. Laughter bounced off the walls, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking beneath the surface. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed a group of men at the bar, rough-looking fellas dressed in dark jackets, speaking in low tones, their laughter sharp and unsettling. The diner had its regulars, and these guys felt like outsiders. He caught snippets of their conversation, the words land, money, and settlements hanging heavily in the air. His heart began to race as he focused in on them. One of them said, glancing around as if to ensure no one was eavesdropping. Jacob's instincts kicked in. He tried to shake off the feeling, but something about their tone sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. He quickly finished his coffee and left the diner, determination pushing him forward. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the heaviness in the air lingered. Jacob surveyed the fields stretching around his farmhouse, the golden stalks swaying gently in the breeze. This land was his life, his family's legacy. He swore he'd protect it, no matter the cost. That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned in his bed, the words of those men echoing in his mind. What exactly were they planning? As the clock ticked toward midnight, a sense of dread settled deeper into his gut. Then it happened. A loud crash pulled him from his restless thoughts. Heart racing, Jacob scrambled out of bed and rushed to the window. The barn door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the wind, its hinges creaking ominously. He sprinted down the stairs, grabbing the flashlight off the kitchen table, and headed toward the barn, each step heavier than the last. Once outside, the wind whipped against him, a foreboding whisper in his ear. He shone the light inside the barn, revealing two figures cloaked in darkness, rummaging through his tools. Fear clawed at his throat, but he pushed it down. He had to confront them. He shouted, voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The figures froze, startled by the sudden light. One of them turned, and Jacob's gut twisted at the sight of a familiar face, the taller man from the diner. Just a little visit, Turner, the man sneered, his voice laced with contempt. Jacob took a step forward, the flashlight beam steady in his grip. You're trespassing. Call him, the man replied, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He's not going to help you. The other figure moved closer, and Jacob's heart raced. He felt endangered, surrounded by intruders who didn't care about him or his family's legacy. I won't sell, Jacob replied, defiance rising within him. Not selling, the tall man laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Before Jacob could respond, the two men turned and bolted into the night, disappearing into the darkness like phantoms. But their laughter echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the threat that loomed over him. In the coming days, the feelings of unease turned to paranoia. Jacob fortified the farmhouse, adding locks and motion lights around the property. But as he toiled under the sun during the day, the shadows stalked him at night. Each creak of the old house and howl of the wind sent his heart racing. One afternoon, he decided to confront his neighbors, unsure of how to convey the threats he felt bearing down on him. It was an informal meeting at the diner that brought them together. With cautious voices, they shared their worry. Word had spread a group of criminals was targeting farmers, hoping to intimidate them into selling their land at cut-rate prices. We have to stick together, Jacob said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The group nodded, and he could feel a united spirit building. They decided to keep watch and share any suspicious activity, pooling their resources and experiences. Days turned into weeks, and the chilling presence of those men was not gone. Jacob woke each night with a start, expecting to find them lurking at his doorstep. The more he fought against the fear, the more it consumed him. What if they were right? Would he truly be able to stand against them? One evening, as darkness enveloped the fields, the familiar sound of a truck engine growled near the edge of his property. Jacob felt the familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, heart pounding. At the edge of the dirt path, he spotted the same men from before, gathered in a cluster. They weren't shy about showing up anymore. The tall one caught sight of Jacob and sauntered forward, confidence oozing from every pore. He mocked, gesturing to the reinforced locks and lights. Jacob's fear ignited into anger. You think you can walk onto my land and bully me? Intimidation is not the goal, Jacob. It's about understanding the reality of your situation, he replied, smirking. You either sell or we might have to make things uncomfortable for you. Jacob's grip tightened around the flashlight. With a contemptuous grin, the tall man simply shrugged. Just remember, old man, every day you refuse our offer makes it harder on you. With that, they climbed back into their truck, leaving Jacob standing there, fury boiling inside him like a simmering pot about to overflow. That night, he couldn't sleep. He felt cornered, the weight of his land pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. It had always been his sanctuary, a source of pride and connection, but now it felt like a target. A few days later, after another sleepless night, Jacob got up early and checked the fields. Something was off. The crops, usually swaying gently in the breeze, looked forlorn. As he walked through the rows of corn, he saw it trampling. Footprints ripped through the earth, a clear sign of earlier trespassing. His heart sank. These men were escalating their efforts, and he could no longer ignore it. He gathered his neighbors that evening, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he laid out the evidence. It's time to make a stand. We have to protect our land together, every single one of us, he urged, looking each farmer in the eye. Jim, the farmer who had stood by him since the beginning, raised his hand. Let's organize patrols. We can set up watches at night and take shifts. Right, Jacob nodded, the fire within him igniting. It's about more than just us. That night they took their positions, spread out among the fields, flashlights in hand, rifles slung across their backs as they became sentinels of their own destiny. Each creak of the wind sent jitters through their bodies, and every rustling leaf made them hyper-aware of their surroundings. But they stood strong, resisting with unwavering resolve. Soon their efforts bore fruit. The criminals were spotted several times, lurking in the shadows, but they never dared to approach the farmers. The sight of a united front was enough to make them reconsider their tactics. After weeks of anxiety, determination began to replace the fear. The farmers supported one another, every success fueling their spirits. However, Jacob knew the fight wasn't over. The criminals were still at large, plotting their next move. Then word came through town that there was a crucial meeting set to take place at the old barn on the edge of Millersville. The criminals were gathering, likely strategizing their next steps. Jacob felt a mix of dread and purpose build within him. Let's expose them, he declared to his neighbors. It was a risky plan, but they couldn't allow the criminals to continue breeding fear in their community. Jacob and a few farmers decided to infiltrate the meeting, hide out among the shadows, and gather valuable intel. As night fell, they crept toward the old barn, hearts pounding in unison. The sound of muffled laughter echoed from within. They huddled close, straining to hear snippets of conversation. "I don't care how we do it, just make sure we get that Turner land," one of the men growled. Jacob clenched his fists, a torrent of anger surging through him. He felt the heat of determination rise. They were trying to break him, but they underestimated his resolve. After gathering enough information, they slipped away unnoticed, ready to share what they had learned. The anger and anxiety of the farmers morphed into a powerful collective rage. This is war, Jacob thought, heart-pounding, fateful resolve guiding him. The following night, local law enforcement joined them. Armed with evidence gathered over weeks, Jacob stood before the sheriff, voice steady yet emotionally charged. "We can't let them take our homes." With the sheriff's backing, they organized a meeting to expose the criminals' plans, inviting the townsfolk to learn the risks they faced. As Jacob spoke, faces filled with anger and determination, stories intertwined into a tapestry of resilience. The night of the presentation, the old barn glowed warmly as the townspeople gathered. Jacob stood at the front, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "What we face is frightening, but we are stronger together. This land is ours." As his voice rose, so did a collective roar from the people present. They felt the strength within them, igniting a flame that had long been smothered by fear. United, they would stand against the darkness threatening their way of life. With community support growing, Jacob felt hope swell within him. Improvised watch groups and neighborhood patrols turned the tide of fear, but the battle was far from over. The criminals would not relinquish their ambition easily. Days passed in anxious anticipation, but finally brought a crucial turning point. The law enforcement officials, acting on the information gathered from the meeting in Jacob's coalition, raided the hideout of the criminals. The air felt electric with tension as they surrounded the barn where the men plotted their schemes, ready to confront the threat head-on. Jacob watched, heart pounding in his chest, listening to the sounds of justice unfolding, the growl of engines roaring to life, the bang of doors bursting open. Chills shot down his spine as he realized that their collective efforts had finally paid off. They had taken back control. The news spread through Millersville like wildfire. The criminals, once so confident, were now being apprehended, their plans unmasked. Jacob felt a triumphant wave wash over him as a sense of relief filled the air. Still, he knew the land was about more than just victory over criminals. It was about the community he had fought to protect. He stood in the fields, the sun dipping low on the horizon, illuminating the corn swaying gently in the wind. Together, they had done more than resist. They had built a bond that would last beyond the trials they faced. Each crowing rooster, every rustling leaf felt like a promise. The land would thrive, the community would flourish, and together they would conquer any storm that dared to. As Jacob Turner looked out over his fields, the warmth of the sun on his skin and support surrounding him, he smiled, knowing they had refused to yield against darkness, reclaiming their strength, their legacy, and their land. In that moment, everything felt right. The heart of Millersville beat strong. The moon hung high in the starry sky, a pale witness to the flickering shadows dancing across the old Turner farm. Jacob Turner stood at his kitchen window, watching as the wind whispered through the cornfields. It should have been a peaceful sight, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, a storm not just of nature, but of human greed and malice. Earlier that day, at the local diner, he had overheard whispered conversations that sent a chill racing down his spine. A group of men, strangers to Millersville, sat at a corner booth, their voices low but sharp as glass. Words like land acquisition and easy money pricked Jacob's ears. His heart began to race as he pieced together what they were plotting. They weren't just passing through, they were hunting for something far more valuable than a meal. Later that night, as he lay in bed, the sounds of the farm comforted him. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant croak of frogs, all reminders of home. But sleep eluded him, the weight of uncertainty pressing heavily on his chest. As he stared at the ceiling, doubt seeped in. What if those men were indeed after his land? What if he couldn't protect what had been in his family for generations? Then, just as the clock ticked toward midnight, chaos erupted. A loud crash jolted him from bed. Jacob's heart raced as he grabbed his flashlight and bolted out the door. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he pressed forward, fear turning into rage. He was not about to let anyone take what was rightfully his. As he approached the barn, the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing two figures inside, rummaging through his tools. Jacob shouted, the authoritative timbre in his voice surprising even himself. The men froze. In the darkness, he recognized the taller one, the one from the diner. "Just a little visit, Jacob," the man sneered. Jacob's grip tightened on the flashlight. "Get out." The man took a step forward, a smug grin plastered across his face. "You might want to reconsider your tone. We own some friends in high places." The fight surged within Jacob like a wildfire. His father had worked this land, and so had his grandfather. Generations had poured their sweat and dreams into the soil. No outsider would come in and disrupt that legacy. The men exchanged glances and hastily retreated into the night, laughter trailing behind like a dark cloud. Jacob stood there, heart pounding, the taste of victory mingling with dread. They may have left, but they wouldn't forget him or his defiance. Over the next few weeks, unease settled like a dense fog over Millersville. Jacob fortified his farmhouse, changing locks and reinforcing the barn, yet each creak of the floorboards at night sent jitters down his spine. Who were these men and how far would they go to claim his land? His doubts were confirmed at the next town meeting. As residents gathered in the old church, Jacob took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The room was filled with familiar faces and anxious whispers. "I've seen some unfamiliar faces lately," he began. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Jim, a fellow farmer, spoke up. "I've had a couple of run-ins myself." Another farmer, Sarah, chimed in, her voice trembling. "My sister got a visit too." Jacob clutched the podium, channeling their shared fear into resolve. "We can't panic, we have to band together." As the weeks rolled on, Jacob and a handful of farmers formed a coalition, keeping watch over each other's land. They took turns patrolling the fields at night, flashlights in hand, hearts pounding with each rustle of grass. Fear was a haunting shadow, but along with it came newfound strength, a sense of unity that had been missing in the community. One chilly night, as Jacob patrolled his fields with Jim, he distinctly heard voices drifting in from the tree line. He motioned for Jim to stay quiet as they crept closer. There, hidden among the shadows, were the strangers, their low murmurs mixing with the sound of the wind. "They think they can keep this land," one man sneered. "We'll make them regret it, they're just farmers." As they listened in horror, Jacob felt a surge of anger. How dare they threaten not just him, but all of them? He knew then that this fight was about more than just his land. It was about standing up for every farmer in Millersville. The next day, the air was electric with tension as they gathered at the diner once more, sharing their discoveries. "We need to take this to the sheriff," Jacob urged, his voice strong and unwavering. The sheriff, a no-nonsense woman named Betty, sat up straight as they reported their findings. Her expression turned grim as Jacob laid out everything, including the threats, intimidation tactics, and the gathering in the tree line. "We can't let fear rule us," she replied, determination lacing her tone. "I'll increase patrols, but I need you all to document every incident." Feeling empowered, the farmers went back to their fields, armed with flashlights and a sense of purpose. With each passing night, they stood shoulder to shoulder, the spirit of community lighting a fire within them. They were not just farmers anymore, they became guardians of their land, protectors of their legacy. But the criminals wouldn't back down easily. One evening, Jacob heard a commotion coming from the barn. Heart racing, he sprinted outside. As he neared, he saw the figures looming again. They were back, emboldened by their previous encounters. Jacob roared, brandishing his flashlight like a weapon. One of the men moved forward, laughing, his bravado shining through the darkness. "You really think you can stop us?" Jacob felt like a dam had broken within him. "You have no right to this land. This place belongs to my family." The men hesitated, and for a moment Jacob felt the tide turn, but just as quickly they backed off, retreating into the darkness, taunting as they went. That night, adrenaline coursing through him, Jacob gathered his fellow farmers. "They're not afraid of us. We need to escalate our efforts." With renewed purpose, they agreed to hold a town meeting, an assembly where every farmer would come together, united not just to discuss but to plan action. As word spread through Millersville, excitement mixed with anxiety. This became more than just a defense, it became a movement. In the coming days, Jacob worked tirelessly, coordinating efforts, crafting plans to hold the criminals accountable. The night of the meeting, the church was packed. Voices echoed, each farmer carrying stories, fears, and hopes. As Jacob stood in front of the crowd, the weight of history pressed down on him. "We stand here today not just for ourselves, but for the future of our farms, our families. We cannot cower in fear." His words sent waves of energy rippling through the crowd, the spirit of community ignited like a powder keg ready to explode. They knew they could either yield to fear or rise together. Then, as if summoned by fate, the lights flickered and the door creaked open. The sheriff entered, thick with authority. "I've got news for you," she said, standing tall. "The state has increased funding for rural protection." A roar of approval erupted from the crowd. Jacob felt his heart soar. They were gaining momentum, but he knew they needed more than just understanding, they needed evidence. And so they transformed their nights into watchful vigils, documenting every sighting, each whispered threat. As weeks turned into months, tensions rose. The criminals grew bolder, and Jacob felt the suffocating weight of every inch of land he was trying to protect. Then came the night they had all been waiting for. Information had slipped through the grapevine. An important meeting was being held at a nearby abandoned warehouse. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the break they needed. Jacob, Jim, and the others crept toward the warehouse under cover of night, armed with cell phones and flashlights. The air was electric with anticipation as they gathered outside, peering through cracks in the wooden panels. Shadows flitted inside, voices rising like a storm. "Tonight is the night we take everything from that Turner farm," the tall man's voice dripped with venom. Jacob felt the heat of anger surge inside him. This was their chance. He motioned for the others to get ready. With steady breaths, they pushed the door open, catching the men off guard. Jacob shouted. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. They hadn't expected a united front of farmers crashing their meeting. As confusion spread across the criminals' faces, Jacob pressed on. "You think you can intimidate us?" Betty stepped forward, her sheriff's badge gleaming under the dim light. "You are under arrest for harassment, trespassing, and conspiracy." Panic washed over the criminals as realization dawned on them. This was not just a confrontation. They were caught. In that moment, Jacob felt the weight of victory. For weeks they had fought back against darkness, and now, finally, they were on the brink of reclaiming not just their land, but their sense of belonging. The police moved in and handcuffs clinked as the men were arrested, faces pale with disbelief. The tall man spat, but Jacob felt a surge of triumph. As the truck pulled away, headlights cutting through the night, Jacob turned to his fellow farmers. They stood shoulder to shoulder, adrenaline still pulsing through their veins. "We did it," he murmured, disbelief mixed with joy. But the battle had taught them more than just the importance of vigilance. It had shown them the power of unity, the strength found in each other. Days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, a sense of calm returned to Millersville. The field swayed gently, the air filled with the scent of fresh earth, a reminder of both struggle and hope. Jacob stood on his porch, feeling the sun warm his skin as he surveyed the land. This farm was more than just property. It was filled with memories, dreams, and a legacy they had fought hard to preserve. He felt a weight lift as he saw his neighbors come together, working the fields and sharing laughter. They had risen against the threats that had once seemed so formidable, and through it all they had forged an unbreakable bond. Millersville had weathered the storm. Together, they refused to yield, and as they stood on the brink of a new day, Jacob knew that their fight wasn't over. It had only just begun, but with every dawn they would rise again, stronger and more resolute than ever before. In the heart of the countryside, where the sun kissed the earth, hope blossomed alongside the fields. And Jacob smiled, ready for whatever came next. The sun sank below the horizon, bathing the Turner farm in an eerie twilight glow, casting long shadows over the fields that had been tended to for generations. Jacob Turner stood on his porch, wiping the sweat from his brow after a long day's work. He took a moment to catch his breath, allowing the stillness of the night to envelop him. But this calm was a facade, a thin veil masking something sinister lurking just beyond the edges of Millersville. Earlier that day, as Jacob had driven into town, he spotted a couple of unfamiliar trucks parked near the diner. The rough men who climbed out of those vehicles had an air about them that sent a shiver down his spine, a sense of danger mixed with the allure of something elusive. At first, he brushed it off as paranoia. After all, this was a quiet farming town where the biggest threat was a wayward deer. But as he sat in the diner, dark eyes scanned the room, watching the locals, whispering to each other in corners. Their laughter fell flat like a ruse dressed up in friendly banter, and Jacob's instincts kicked in. He asked the waitress, who shrugged, her face pale. "They've been talking about land, yours in particular," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob felt the familiar tightening of fear in his gut. The Turner family had owned this farm for generations. It was more than just dirt and crops, it was blood, sweat, and history. That night, as he lay in bed, unease twisted in his stomach like a coiled spring. He knew something had to be done. With the land under threat, he felt a responsibility not only for his legacy, but for the entire community. As the days passed, the tension thickened like the humidity before a storm. Jacob bolted out of bed one day, heart racing after a nightmare that had felt too real. Groaning, he rubbed his temples, remembering the faces of those men. They wouldn't leave him alone. Fueled by concern and resolve, he decided to pay them a visit, confront them. Pulling up to the diner later that day, he spotted them leaning against their trucks, scowling like wolves guarding their prey. Jacob sensed their eyes bore into him, its weight crawling under his skin as he approached, determination blazing in his soul like fire. He challenged, crossing his arms over his chest. The tallest man stepped forward, his smirk dripping with disdain. "We're here for your land, Jacob." "Fair," Jacob retorted, a swell of anger rising. The men laughed, but beneath that laughter thrummed a thread of menace. The tall man whispered, leaning closer. "This land is worth more to us than it is to some old farmer stuck in his ways." Jacob's heart raced, anger clashing with fear. He wouldn't back down, not today, not ever. He shouted, every ounce of defiance breaking free. The men exchanged dark glances, a silent agreement forming between them. Jacob's heart sank as he sensed the threat lingering and knew this was just the beginning. That evening, he returned home, the familiar sounds of crickets and rustling leaves providing little comfort. Felt the weight of what had transpired settle heavily on his chest like a stone. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Jacob steeled himself for what lay ahead. The following day dawned bright, though shadows loomed in Jacob's mind. He headed into town, determined to rally support from the other farmers. At the local feed store, he felt the atmosphere shift as he approached. Under the fluorescent lights, conversations hushed. The fear was palpable. Jacob asked Kyle, his neighbor, who stood with a few others. Kyle nodded solemnly. "I've had a couple of encounters with them, tried to convince me to sell my land too." Together, they huddled closer, sharing stories of intimidation, threats whispered in the dark. Each account was a note in a grim symphony of fear, yet the threads of resolve began to weave stronger. "They think they can scare us," Jacob declared, voice rising with passion. "We need to stand together. We have to protect what's ours." murmurs of agreement rippled through the farmers. Jacob felt hope blossom amidst the tension. They organized a meeting that night at the local church, determined to share their experiences, to arm each other with information and courage. As the fire crackled in the corner of the small room, Jacob stood before the gathered farmers' friends, neighbors, and family, all intertwined in the struggle. "We've faced down storms, droughts, and bad seasons," he said, voice strong and unwavering. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of strength crashing over each person present. As they exchanged stories of their encounters, a spark ignited, a reminder that fear was only powerful when faced alone. United, they would not yield. As the weeks rolled on, Jacob and his fellow farmers drafted strategies, pooling their resources to monitor the land, to document every interaction with the criminals. They built a community watch, set up patrols at night, their spirits lifting. The wind whispered through the fields, carrying with it a newfound sense of purpose. But the criminals were still lurking, waiting for an opportunity to strike. One evening, under the cover of darkness, Jacob felt the anxiety creep back, wrapping around him like a cold blanket. The patrol had spotted movement near the edge of the property, barely visible in the glow of the moonlight. Jacob followed, heart racing, adrenaline pulsing through his veins. When he arrived, he saw the familiar figures, their silhouettes arching against the stars. Fear twisted in his gut as he recognized the talkative tall man. "It's time to show these farmers who runs this town," the man sneered, his voice low. Jacob motioned to the others, a silent command, and they huddled close, peering through the trees. The men mocked his resolve, confident that they could intimidate him into selling. Rage boiled inside Jacob, and he knew it was time to take a stand. They crept closer, their breaths shallow, hearts pounding like thunder against the storm of their fear. "They will not take what's ours," Jacob whispered, glancing at each of his friends, determination igniting in their eyes. Then something snapped within him, a surge of bravery. Bursting from the cover of the trees, Jacob shouted, "You don't own this land." The criminals turned, taken aback by the coalition confronting them. The tall man's bravado faltered, and for a moment the confidence slipped away. Shouted, retreating into the shadows. In that instant, Jacob felt the tide shift. They had stood their ground, confronted the shadows, and pushed them back. The following days brought whispers of change through Millersville. Jacob and the farmers worked harder than ever, continuing their watch and gathering evidence of the harassment. Slowly, the sense of fear lifted, replaced with resolve and courage. Jacob felt the weights of history bearing down on him, and he sensed that what they were fighting for was bigger than himself. But the criminals were relentless. One cold night, Jacob received a text from Jim, their meeting in the old barn. Feeling the pulse of adrenaline, Jacob rallied his friends, and together they snuck toward the barn, shrouded in darkness. They knew this was their chance to gather evidence, to expose the plans laid in hidden corners. As they approached, hushed voices fell from within, and Jacob focused, straining to hear. "Tonight is the night we take it all," the tall man whispered. With little hesitation, Jacob motioned for his friends to move in. They swung open the doors, revealing the criminals in their lair, eyes wide with shock as Jacob stepped forward, fueled by fury. Jacob boomed, voice like a clap of thunder. "What?" the tall man stammered, confusion and anger mingling in a dangerous cocktail. In that direct confrontation, the line had been drawn. Witnessing Jacob's unwavering courage, Jim lifted his chin, and the others advanced beside him, forming a wall, a living testament to their unity. The criminals were backpedaling now, realizing they'd pushed too far this time. The sheriff had been tipped off on their activities, and soon the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. "You're all going to regret this," the tall man said, backing away, but there was panic in his eyes. Through the shadows, the authoritative presence of law enforcement arrived, sweeping in with both purpose and urgency. The tide had turned, driven by community and solidarity. "Step away from the barn," a commanding voice echoed, and the criminals found themselves trapped. With evidence stacked against them and their desperation laid bare, the men were apprehended, their plans laid to ruin. Jacob felt the rush of victory wash over him like cool rain after a long drought. As dawn broke over the fields, the sun bathed the Turner farm in a warm, golden hue. Jacob stood on his porch, surveying what he had fought to defend. This land wasn't just soil beneath his feet. It was love, history, and dreams stitched together in every row of corn that swayed gently in the breeze. The echoes of victory reverberated through Millersville as the farmers came together, knowing they had won not just a battle, but a war. Together, they had faced darkness head-on and emerged unyielding, stronger than ever before. With each passing day, Jacob felt renewed hope. They had reclaimed their home, but more than that, they had cultivated a spirit that would withstand anything. He smiled, heart full, knowing the heart of Millersville was beating strong, ready for whatever challenges might come next. And together, they would always stand tall, unwavering against any storm that threatened their precious land. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting an amber glow over the lush fields of corn that waved like an emerald sea under the gentle evening breeze. But this picturesque scene was shattered by a storm brewing in the heart of Millersville. Something foul had crept into the peaceful lives of the townsfolk. Jacob Turner, a proud farmer in his 50s, stood at the edge of his field, his hands calloused from decades of toil. Yet today those hands trembled slightly, a reflection of the anxiety gnawing at his gut. Just days before, while fueling up at the local gas station, he'd overheard a group of men talking in hushed tones. Their laughter was grating, and their eyes darted like predators scanning for prey. Between sips of their coffees, he caught snippets of their conversation, a bleak landscape of fear where words like buyout, takeover, and poor decisions hung in the air. Farmers are like old trees, one had said, a sinister grin stretching across his face. Jacob's heart raced as the words penetrated his thoughts like a knife, leaving a mark that wouldn't fade. That night, he leaned against his kitchen counter, staring out into the yard where the moonlight cast a silvery sheen over his crops. Each stalk of corn was a testament to his family's legacy, nurtured through generations with the sweat of hard work and the love of the land. He remembered his father's voice, steady and firm, "Protect what's yours, son." But now, the fight felt daunting. Summoning his courage, Jacob decided to confront the threat head-on. He put it off long enough. It was time to stake his claim. The next morning, as the dawn broke, he made a beeline for the diner. The air buzzed with anxious chatter, but Jacob's presence moved through the room like a gust of wind. "It's just a matter of time," one of them said, casting a furtive glance toward the rest of the diner. Jacob approached their booth, determination flooding through him. "You're nothing but bullies, and I won't stand for it." The men snickered, their eyes glinting with malice. "We're not here to negotiate, old man," the tall one spat. "We can make this really tough on you if you don't see things our way." Jacob felt his heart hammer in his chest, but he wouldn't yield. "You're mistaken if you think you can intimidate me. This land is my family's legacy." The men leaned back, their expressions twisting into mockery. Feeling the heat of their hostility, Jacob stepped back, anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew this was just the beginning of a battle that could tear apart everything he held dear. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in Millersville grew charged. Jacob spent sleepless nights pacing his farmhouse, fear gnawing at his insides like a ravenous animal. He took to calling neighbors, forming alliances, sharing his fears. He asked Kyle, who ran the local hardware store. "Yeah," Kyle replied, eyes wide. "They tried to corner me too, said I could make a lot of money if I sold out." With each shared story, the farmers felt a unity take form, and the whispers of fear transformed into a chorus of defiance. They began to gather regularly, mapping out plans, sharing intel about the looming threat. But the sense of security was quickly undercut one fateful evening when Jacob stepped outside to check on his livestock. The air was heavy, and an unsettling silence draped over the farm like a ghost. As he made his way to the barn, a flash of movement caught his eye. Heart racing, he turned to see two figures lurking at the edge of his property. He shouted, the words roaring from his lips. The figures froze, and one turned to face him, the tall man from the diner, a wicked grin plastered on his face. "Thought you could hide behind your friends?" Fear gripped Jacob, ice coursing through his veins. He roared, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The criminals didn't flinch, they simply laughed, their confidence unshaken. It was a clever reminder of the power dynamics at play, one man against the darkness wrapped in bravado. Then a flash caught Jacob's eye. His neighbor Tim stood nearby, watching from the shadows. Tim nodded, emboldened by his presence. With a sense of solidarity blooming in his chest, Jacob's resolve deepened. "I'm not afraid of you," Jacob said, stepping toward the men. A flicker of surprise passed through the tall man's eyes before they returned to their sinister humor. "Enjoy your little fight, Jacob." With that, they slipped away into the night, leaving Jacob in the suffocating silence once more. But this time he wouldn't go back inside to wait for the next confrontation. He dialed Jim's number, urgency pulsing in his voice. "We need to meet." The farmers gathered in Jacob's barn that night, the air thick with tension and determination. As they shared their stories, Jacob spoke up, heart pounding in his ears. "We need to act swiftly." They agreed to patrol the fields together, each farmer taking a turn to keep watch at night. They would show these men that they were fearless. One farmer alone may feel vulnerable, but united, they would be an unbreakable force. As the days turned into nights, each farmer took their posts, patrolling the fields with flashlights in hand, ready to defend their land against any invaders. The wind rustled through the corn, creating a symphony of sound that echoed their united spirit. But one particularly tense evening, while patrolling alone, Jacob caught sight of movement near the tree line. A dark shadow slunk between the trees, his instincts screaming. Heart racing, he flicked on his flashlight, illuminating the figure slinking away. "Hey," he shouted, chasing after it, adrenaline thrumming through him. Rounding a stand of trees, he stumbled upon one of the criminals crouched, trying to hide behind a gnarled oak. Fear and anger collided in Jacob as he confronted him, rage boiling over. He shouted, confronting the man as he drew near. The criminal hissed, sneering as he stumbled to his feet, retreating back toward the shadows. But Jacob wouldn't let him escape so easily, determination coursing through his veins. He lunged forward, but the criminal darted into the underbrush, disappearing into the night. Jacob stood there panting, heart hammering in his chest as a new realization set in this battle would not end easily. Returning to the farmhouse, he gathered his neighbors and shared what had transpired. They're getting desperate. Fear flickered in the eyes of the farmers, but resolve followed close behind. "I'm in," Jim said, his voice strong. That night, they vowed to double their efforts, reinforcing patrols and putting together a strategic plan. They would document every encounter, every threat, and draw the line in the sand. They were no longer just farmers, they were warriors, ready to reclaim their home. Weeks passed, and though the tension in the air grew thicker, so did their resolve. But soon, whispers reached their ears that sent a cold shiver down Jacob's spine. The criminals were not just aiming to scare them anymore, they were planning something bigger, a confrontation that could change everything. Late one stormy night, a frantic knock echoed through the Turner farmhouse. Jacob and his neighbors stood blinking in confusion, confused by the urgent rap against the door. He stepped forward and pulled it open to find a neighbor, his face pale as a ghost. He gasped, breathless. "I saw their trucks, 3 of them." Fear coursed through Jacob like icy water. It was no longer just intimidation, this was a full-blown attack. He quickly gathered his friends, adrenaline clouding his thoughts. They sprang into action, adrenaline propelling them as the shadows crept closer on the horizon. But as they worked, the sense of urgency intensified. They could hear the growl of engines drawing near, dark figures moving against the backdrop of lightning illuminating the sky. Then everything exploded into chaos. The criminals burst onto the property, headlights illuminating the farm before them like the dawn of a new menace. Jacob felt a rush of fear, but also of fury. This was his home. He had fought for this land and would not go down without a fight. He shouted, standing firm as his neighbors flanked him, hearts pounding in unison. The criminals climbed out of their vehicles, faces twisted in malicious grins, armed and ready for destruction. The tall man taunted, swaggering forward. Jacob roared, each word laced with defiance. And with that, the darkness exploded into a chaotic clash of confrontation, one man's courage igniting a battle for the soul of their community. As the thunder roared overhead, old friendships and new alliances cemented into an unbreakable force. But beneath the chaos, a secret lingered, an uneasy truth that whispered through the fields even as fists and shouts filled the air. This battle was only just beginning, and the outcome would forever change Millersville. The sun may rise tomorrow, but would it rise on a land free from the threat of tyranny, or would it shine on the remnants of broken dreams? The answers lay suspended in the storm, both within and beyond, waiting to be unearthed. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the farm hung precariously in the balance.